we have the strongest grounds for causal inference whatsoever. Now let's take a look at the logic of experimentation and at the types of variables and the role they play in determining the reality that we're studying. How does experiment actually work? The logic of experiment is very simple. We have two or more sets of conditions. And in those sets of conditions, there are various factors, but they are supposed to only differ in one parameter, the presence or absence of the cause that we believe was the cause of the problem. When I was a student and I took a course on logic, our teacher gave us this example. Imagine that two students ate in a student canteen, and one of them got diarrhea and another one didn't have. Now they are comparing what they ate. The first one says, I ate soup, and that is A. And the second one says, okay, I ate it too, so it's not the cause of our problem. Then the first one says, I also ate steak. And the second one says, I also ate steak, so B is probably also not the cause of our problem. And then the first one says, I did not drink any fruit stew. And the second one says, oops, I did. And then they infer that the only difference in the conditions, the only difference in the menu that they were exposed to, the only difference in the food they ate was this fruit stew. And that probably is the cause for diarrhea. This is exactly the logic that we follow in experimentations. We have an experimental group and we have a control group. And there are many different conditions in those two groups, like maybe the time of day, the lighting, and there is the difference in the condition that we believe is the cause, our independent variable. And then we observe the differences in the effect. And as long as two groups differ only in the presence or absence of the cause, and all the other factors are held completely constant, then we can make a strong causal inference. There are no plausible alternative explanations. But if it appears that, for example, experimental and control group, they are also different in some other things, like the time of day when experiment is taking place, or the number of people with high IQ, etc., this could be a confound. This could be a plausible alternative explanation for the differences in the effect that we observe. So ideally, the two groups, the two situations that we create should only differ in one factor, that is our independent variable. And obviously, in order to make sure that this happens, and in order to be able to make a valid causal conclusion, you need to have the opportunity to manipulate the reality that you are studying. If you are just observing something from the side, you can never be sure that there is this causal association. And this is illustrated well, I think, by this cartoon, when the dog in Pavlov's apparatus says, watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. But obviously, maybe the dog is only observing statistical association, but causal inference might be actually quite wrong. And this problem of the dog often is our problem when we conduct cross-sectional correlational research. What kind of factors, what kind of variables play a role in our experimental situations? In order to classify them, let's just remember our old paradigm of the black box. The black box is our research object. It is the reality that we are interested in, and it is not accessible to us for direct observation, etc. What we can do is we can manipulate the external factors. For example, if it's an alien spaceship, we can flash it with flashlights, or we can play music to it. And these interventions, our independent variables, are the factors that we vary in order to see if they have a role in determining the effects. And these effects are dependent variables. Dependent variables are all the things that we can measure, observe, or record to make some judgment about what's happening with our reality that we are interested in. And unfortunately, there are always these extraneous variables, potential confounds, the factors that also influence the reality that we are studying. And sometimes their effects may coincide with the effects of our independent variables. And as a result, we have alternative explanations that we are not able to rule out. And this is a fairly bad situation. And during the seminars, you will play this little game of spot the confound. Try to come up with this alternative explanation. And this is a part of critical thinking that is also very important. So let's take a look at the different types of variables that we have in psychology. What are the causes whose effects we could potentially study? These are all the things that we can manipulate in our experiments. Very often, these are characteristics of the task. For example, one person might get neutral pictures, another person might get emotionally arousing pictures, and then we see what happens. Or this could be situational conditions. If you remember the classical experiments of Schechter and Singer, one person was sitting in a room where the confederate was showing anger or irritation, and another person was sitting in the room where the confederate was showing joy or relaxation, and this had an influence in determining the emotional state of the person who was in that room and who did not know that the other person in the room was not a fellow participant but a confederate of the experimenter. Functional state of the subjects. We can manipulate it by showing people, for example, emotional or neutral videos, some scary videos or some funny videos, or we can inject them with adrenaline or placebo, as Schechter and Singer did in their classical experiments. Of course, from an ethical point of view, this can be somewhat challenging, so make sure you get an ethics approval before you inject people with whatever. And finally, there is a fourth type of independent variables, things that we cannot really manipulate, but in their effects we are also very often interested. These are fixed individual properties, such as gender or IQ, that can potentially play a role in determining outcomes. Unfortunately, we cannot manipulate those things. Now, well, obviously we can manipulate gender nowadays and we can change it, but not within the context of an experimental study. We cannot randomly assign people to be males or females, at least at present. Or IQ, unfortunately, we cannot also randomly assign people to be smart or less smart. As a result, we have what we call non-equivalent groups, and we have a special term for these variables. They are called subject variables. Why do we say that these groups are non-equivalent? Well, because obviously males and females do not only differ in gender, but there might be other characteristics that are related to gender. Like, for example, experiences of growing up. When you grow up as a boy or grow up as a girl, you face a little different social environments. And maybe those are the things that determine outcomes and not gender itself. So this is why we say when we have subject variables, it is non-equivalent groups, because we cannot ensure that males and females are exactly equal in everything except for this gender characteristic. One tricky aspect of independent variables, if you are manipulating something and your independent variable is not directly the thing that you are manipulating, but you create it by this manipulation, you need to actually prove that your manipulation affects this independent variable before showing that this independent variable has effects on something. Let's take, for example, emotions. Emotions are often used as independent variables in research, but you cannot observe emotions directly, and you cannot manipulate emotions directly. So what we do is we show people funny videos or scary videos, for example, and this way we can create positive or negative emotional states. But whenever you do this, you need to prove that your scary video does really create negative emotions and that your funny video does create positive emotions, because it may turn out that the video that seems funny or scary to you is not funny or scary to your research subjects, to your participants. Maybe they perceive it as boring. That's why when we manipulate variables that we cannot observe directly, like emotions or functional states, we always do this manipulation check before we do our main experimental procedure. We give people a brief emotion questionnaire to make sure that our manipulation worked, that they really are in different emotional states before proceeding to measure the things that might be influenced by those emotional states and the things that we are interested in. Sometimes, in order to make sure that our manipulation works as intended, we conduct a separate pilot study, just showing people a bunch of videos to choose the videos that are really, really very scary and really, really very funny, because we want to have strong manipulations in order to observe stronger experimental effects. So much about independent variables. The second group of variables, dependent variables, are our effects. These are the outcomes that we can observe, measure, record, and these outcomes can be basically whatever we can measure in psychology. It can be objective behavior, like, for example, in this classical obedience experiments of Stanley Milgram, he observed how people would react. Would they proceed with electric shocks or would they stop? This can be some physiological indicators. We could monitor also blood pressure or some kind of galvanic skin responses, not speaking of all kinds of MRIs if you have a lot of money and equipment. Psychometric scores, you can measure traits or abilities, those fixed individual properties that are relatively stable. But if you're interested in a teaching program, whether it develops abilities or not, obviously your dependent variable will be something related to ability. And very often these are states or more flexible state-like variables, like, for example, attitudes or beliefs about things. Especially in social psychology, this often happens, or emotions, or cognitions, some kind of conclusions, etc. So basically everything that we can measure can be a dependent variable. And our life would be easy and beautiful if we did not have those extraneous variables, those nasty confounds that also intervene with the reality that we are studying and that attempt always to spoil our nice and wonderful causal conclusion. What kind of confounds do we typically have in science? These confounds have been discovered in classical studies, and they are described in all textbooks on experimental psychology. Some of these confounds have to do with ourselves, with the experimenters. One classical type of these confounds are the experimental expectations, experimenters' expectations. So if I have formulated a hypothesis that is very dear to my heart, and I really, really want this hypothesis to be true, I may unconsciously influence the outcomes of my experiment. For example, I might unconsciously speak with slightly different intonation to experimental group and the control group, and this could create the difference in the outcomes. And then again, I may not even be aware of this subconscious difference. The effect of experimental expectations is also called Pygmalion effect or Rosenthal effect, after Robert Rosenthal, an educational psychologist who conducted one very classical study. He was interested in the effect of teacher expectations on children's academic outcomes. And what he did was very simple. At the beginning of the school year, he measured IQ in all the children. But instead of giving teachers the feedback about children's true IQ, he randomly assigned the results of the test to children. So basically the information that teacher got about the IQ of each child had completely nothing to do with the real ability. But what he observed at the end of the year was that children about whom teachers received the information that their IQ was high were more likely to increase their academic performance. And this increase was smaller for children about whom teachers were told that these children are not very capable. And obviously, consciously, teachers denied ever having any difference in their teaching process. But this expectation had an effect. We don't know exactly what kind of mechanism was there. The effect of personality. Our personalities as experimenters can also play a role in determining our experimental outcomes. If we remember a classical study of Stanley Milgram, his experimental manipulation worked best when it was Stanley Milgram who was actually playing the role of experimenter. But when it was another colleague, associate, or a graduate student, the effect was always weaker, because maybe Stanley Milgram was much more charismatic and research subjects tended to obey. Another confounding variable related to the experimenter is potential bias in interpretation of our results. Unconsciously, we may be tempted to see in our statistical outcomes the things that are not really there, and we might be tempted to manipulate with our procedures of hypothesis testing in order to be able to discover the effect that we are looking for. And then again, we do it unconsciously most often. This is why pre-registration is so important. Stick to the plan that you had before collecting your data. And these are the problems from the side of the experimenter. The second group of problems has to do with the subjects. These are the variables that have to do with subjects' characteristics, their expectations, their motivation, etc. The effect of participant expectations is very strong. Some expectations have to do with just participating in the experiment, and this is called the Hawthorne effect. And the classical story goes about a factory in a place in a small town called Hawthorne, where there were employees, and one day psychologists who were interested in work environments came to them and they said, here guys, we are interested in the way your work environments affect your work performance, so we will be varying little things in your workplaces, like placing lighting in different places or making some small subtle changes to see which type of work environment is optimal for you. And what they discovered was that regardless of the intervention that they did, for everyone, work performance increased. And this was just due to the fact of participating in an experimental study, which created an expectation. Wow, psychologists are interested in our work performance. Maybe our employers are interested in us. So this created motivation to work better. The second type of subjects' expectations is called placebo effect. And this one is very nasty. If your research subjects, if your research participants believe that your intervention should work, they might show change in the predicted direction even when there is no effect whatsoever. Like, for example, you're conducting a training program which is supposed to develop maybe self-confidence, and you are doing a self-confidence questionnaire before and after. But if people in the experimental group believe that your training program is supposed to increase self-confidence, they might be more likely to report higher self-confidence in the end, because that's their expectation. And this placebo effect is very well known in medicine. It's very strong, and we know that for different drugs and for different diseases, this effect is different. For example, it's the strongest for headache. So regardless what you take for headache, is it aspirin or is it some hot tea, it probably works for you. Placebo works with headache in about 70% of all cases. And it's very important to control for this placebo effect. The second source of subjects confounds motivation. If people are participating in an experiment, they might perceive that this situation demands something from them. They might perceive the experimenter as expecting something. And this creates motivation to change their behavior. The third one is interpretation of experimental manipulation. If people know your hypothesis, or maybe if people just guess what your hypothesis is, this is already going to change their behavior. So we need to be more tricky in our experiments to make sure that people don't guess what is really the goal. Social comparisons across experimental conditions. If people from your experimental and your control group have a chance to interact, This creates expectations. Imagine that you're doing a study at a school and you have two groups of children. You're giving a new interesting teaching program to one group and the old classical and somewhat boring teaching program to the other group. And the study takes place maybe over a month. But what happens after your lessons? Children meet in the corridor. They start discussing, oh, this lesson was so interesting, and in our group it was so boring. Maybe um, maybe teachers are more motivated to teach our class, the experimental group thinks, and this creates confound. And finally, the most awful source of subject-related confounds are individual differences. Unfortunately, people are different. If people were all the same, our experiments would be impeccable. But individual differences can always be a source of alternative explanations in groups where you have different individuals in experimental and control group. And finally, there are some tricky variables related to the interaction between experimenter and the subject. You know that some things are easier to do when you have other people present. Other things are more difficult to do when you have other people present, like, for example, giving a public talk. So the presence of experimenter in the room might have an effect on the subject's behavior, and this can potentially create a confound. The road towards discovering all these confounds was difficult, tricky, and scientists made a lot of mistakes on that path. There are some classical cases, some classical stories, like, for example, this Clever Hans case. Hans is not on the right, he's on the left, because Hans was a horse that could read and do math, or at least so the owner claimed. The owner traveled with his horse Hans all over the Germany early in the 20th century. It was, I think, the first decade of the 20th century. And what they would show to the naive audience, the owner would point Hans to mathematical tasks on the blackboard, like, Hans, how much is 7 plus 3? And Hans, obviously, he could not speak, but he would tap his hoof, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., until he tapped 10 times, and then he magically stopped. So everyone thought, oh, can the horse really count? Maybe the horse is really super smart. And there was a special commission of experts, expert psychologists, who observed this horse and tried to figure out, can he really count or not? And this commission was unable to make any conclusion. They thought, oh, well, we don't know. It could be that the horse is possessed of extraordinary brain power. And you can think of possible alternative explanations. Why does the horse tap its hooves a certain number of times when they see a mathematical example on the blackboard? And you can pause the video and reflect on this for a couple of minutes. Now, luckily, there was this smart psychologist named Oskar Pfungst, who thought maybe the horse is able somehow to know the right answer from the person who is asking the question. So Oskar Pfungst tried to change the experimental conditions. For example, at one point, he asked another person who was not the horse owner to point to the mathematical questions on the blackboard. And the performance of the horse slightly decreased, but still, in most cases, the horse would give the correct answer. But then Oskar Pfungst thought, what if perhaps the problem is in that the person who is asking the question knows the answer? And he said, let the person who asks the questions point to the questions without actually seeing them. And the magical ability of the horse to do math disappeared. And as alternative explanation, Oskar Pfungst proposed this ideomotor effect. He thought that maybe when a person knows the right answer, unconsciously when they count the number of taps made by the horse, at some point when the horse is approaching the correct answer, the person starts feeling a little bit more tense because they're expecting that the horse should stop. And this is the moment where the horse actually realizes that it should stop, because it reads this, it's able to sense this emotional tension by the posture or by some other nonverbal behaviors of the person who is asking the question. And this is a classical case of confound that spoiled the experiment. Now, luckily, nowadays, we have quite a bunch of different strategies that allow us to rule out those potential confounds. The classical approach, which is considered the golden standard, is the double-blind method. In medicine, you probably know that the golden standard of testing new drugs is the randomized controlled double-blind trial. What is double-blind method? It is a situation when neither experimenter nor the subjects know whether they are receiving a true intervention or the placebo. If you watched Dr. House series, which is one of my favorites, you probably remember the situation when Dr. House's patients participated in clinical studies, and neither Dr. House nor the patients knew who was receiving the real drug and who was receiving placebo. And this was only known to a special nurse who was sitting in a separate room with all the vials and the list of patients, and she would put the right drug for each patient into a vial, which was not marked and which was passed on to doctors. And Dr. House was constantly trying to guess or trying to manipulate with this double-blind experimentation, which maybe was good for his patients, but was awful for the science. So now when people test, for example, this vaccine against coronavirus in Russia, everyone who gets this shot tries to test for antibodies to make sure if it's placebo or true vaccine. Maybe it's not perfect as an experimental paradigm. So double-blind method. And there should be a placebo. So people who are in the group that is not receiving the true intervention, they should receive some kind of intervention that they believe is the true intervention. That's why, for example, if you are conducting with one group a training which is supposed to increase self-confidence, and with another group you are doing nothing, expectations are only formed in one group. That's why you need to have what we call a placebo intervention. With the group who is doing nothing, you need to conduct some kind of sham training, a training that looks like the real training, but does not have the elements that are supposed to increase self-confidence. And this way, the control group also has the expectations that the training should help. And as a result, you observe some outcomes. That's why sometimes we compare two different interventions instead of comparing intervention versus nothing or wait list. The second approach that we use to control confounds is called deception. We basically lie to our subjects about the true hypothesis of our experiments. Before the beginning of experiment, we say, oh, you're going to participate in a study of memory. But then it appears that people are giving electric shocks to a person behind the wall. And it's not really a study of memory, it's a study of obedience to authority. But if they knew it from the beginning, they would never obey. That's why this type of deception is justified. But when you deceive people, you always need to give debriefing. After the end of the experiment, you need to explain, this is why we did not give you the true information about the experiment. The true hypothesis was this. And please do not tell about it to others until the data collection period is over. Sometimes we can conduct a tacit experiment when people don't really know that they are participating in an experiment. If this is ethical in some situations, then it's a good way of controlling subjects' expectations. If we want to control experimenters' expectations, the best way is to do an automated experiment when it's not a person who is interested in getting a certain result, but it's perhaps a computer program that is interacting with people from two groups. And this way we can make sure that stuff like intonation or some kind of nonverbal behavior is not different across two conditions. And another way of controlling subjects' expectations is post-experimental control of their perception. During the debriefing, you can also ask the people, before you tell them the true story about your hypothesis, how do you think? What we were really studying? And then people say, oh, I think maybe you were studying whether I would obey authority. And then it's not a naive participant. Maybe you need to exclude this person from your sample. So those simple but really efficient ways of controlling the effects of confound variables allow us to rule out some of the most nasty confounds and not fall into the trap of clever Hans. But organizing this whole thing is not an easy task. That's why conducting an experiment is a long process that needs to be very carefully undertaken from the beginning. First, you need to very carefully draft the plan for your experimentation. What are your independent variables? What are your dependent variables? What are the constructs behind these variables? And you write this whole down, and maybe you consult other people to make sure that you did the right thing. What are your potential confounds? You describe your procedure, and it's a good idea to show it to your academic advisor or to discuss it at a research seminar, because other people might potentially be able to spot the confounds in our experiments better than we can. And if your experimental design is seen as fairly safe by others, as giving you the grounds to make the conclusion that you want, you probably will want to pilot your manipulation, because sometimes we are not sure whether our manipulation really works. Are our videos really funny, or are they really boring? Are our videos really scary, or maybe they are kind of weird and disgusting instead of being scary? That's why before actually using these videos in an actual experiment, you need to validate them to make sure that they influence emotional states. And you probably need to do it in a separate group of people, or maybe a smaller group. But you do it before you conduct your main experimental study, because for the main study, you probably recruit a larger sample and do it more carefully, so you don't want to spoil this possibility by using videos that might not work. You don't want to risk it. Then we sample the individuals for our experiment, or we choose the stimulus material, and we motivate people to participate in our experiments. This is also very important. You need to create the proper conditions, maybe to find a laboratory, a place where you would conduct your experiment, and make sure that all the people come with the same kind of motivational set from the beginning. And these conditions need to be the same for all the individuals in your sample, because otherwise your error will increase, and this might be problematic for your conclusions. So ideally, you need to bring everyone to the same lab during the same kind of hours and do exactly the same thing with each participant. And this thing is your experimental manipulation, after which comes this post-experimental interview debriefing, when you explain what your experiment was really about, if you used some deceptions. And finally, when you have collected all the data, you do statistical processing, which is usually very quick and simple. And the hardest part is refusing the temptation of looking at the data before the data collection is over. But do not analyze your results until you have finished your data collection. This might be really tempting to stop your data collection early, or to modify your data collection decisions as a result of looking at the data. And this is the possible place for questionable research practices. So we have taken a look at the principal variables that we have in experimental designs.